Just before we get started, just how we'll handle it tonight. James will be doing a presentation of about 30 minutes or so. After that, we'll have a very brief break, and then we'll invite you all to have a conversation with James about a better public education future in Manitoba. So now I'll turn the conversation over to James.
Thanks, Wayne, for that wonderful introduction, and welcome everyone. Let me start with a particular thanks to CCPA Manitoba. I'm going to be talking about public education tonight, but I'm also going to be talking about reconciliation, about poverty, about healthcare, and many other topics. All of these are topics that you've probably heard spoken about before at CCPA Speaking Up series. And I'd really encourage any of you who are first-time attenders, come back again. These are great venues to have conversations in. I'm a teacher. They're a great venue to learn in, and you will connect with a whole lot of like-minded people who really want not just a better future, but the best future for this province. So it's a real privilege to be here tonight. I'm going to challenge my technology skills, and I am going to, let's see, find my PowerPoint presentation. There it is. And hopefully, there we go. I think my slide shows up. I'm going to be talking tonight about the next steps from Bill 64. And I'd be surprised if anyone here tonight doesn't have some familiarity with Bill 64. This was proposed legislation that was going to reform public education in the province of Manitoba. Thanks to, and I know it's thanks to many of you who are here on this seminar this evening, that Bill 64 was withdrawn. Reflect for a moment as to why it was withdrawn. I want to believe that it was withdrawn because we started, we pursued a wonderful dialogue on public education in this province. And the government, I think, finally listened and decided that Bill 64 was not the direction that the people of the province of Manitoba wanted to move in. The question becomes, what's the next step? And I think before we consider what comes next, we better remind ourselves about what Bill 64 was, because, you know, these things have a habit sometimes of coming back, maybe a different name, maybe a different number, but sometimes the ideas percolate back. So I'm going to take just a few minutes to refresh everyone in what Bill 64 was really about. And then I want to take a look at the recommendations that the Manitoba Teachers Society made to the K12 Education Review Commission, recommendations that public school teachers in the province of Manitoba think will really improve the system for students in classrooms. So Bill 64, the Education Modernization Act, was really about a new model of governance for public education. This flowed in small part from the recommendations of that K-12 Education Review, but the Education Review was so much more than a new governance model that it would be, in my opinion, completely incorrect to say, well, Bill 64 wasn't what we wanted. It came from the Review Commission, so the Review Commission didn't have any good ideas. And I'm going to challenge you and say that that couldn't be further from the truth. I think there's a lot of good recommendations in that education review. However, when we look at those recommendations, Manitoba's public school teachers would like you to consider some really basic principles. And I'm a science teacher by training. And as a science teacher, I like to be really founded in fact. I want to be founded in substance. So my foundation, our foundation, comes from improvements have to be good for students in classrooms. They have to improve learning conditions for Manitoba's public school students. We have a saying within the Teacher Society, I think it's fairly well known, that the working conditions of teachers are the learning conditions of students. Or if you want to look at it differently, the learning conditions of students are the working conditions of their teachers. The two things are inherently linked together. So our goal is to improve things for students in classrooms. Bill 64 was all about governance of the public school system and about centralizing that control within the provincial government. Bill 64 was going to take 37 public school divisions, English language school divisions, and do away with them and establish a single provincial educational authority. What this does fundamentally is it would reduce accountability and reduce transparency. Right now, that transparency, that accountability rests in the hands of school trustees. And you know from the past 6 months, and I certainly applaud the Manitoba School Board Association for lifting up the work that school trustees do so that we all have a better understanding. And in my mind, that's one of the positive outcomes that is flowing from that Bill 64 conversation. We also feel that Bill 64 drastically restricted local community voices in public education. Bill 64 would have created 15 mega regions throughout the province. The city of Winnipeg, 100,000 plus students, 650,000 people, would have become one of these 15 regions. Each region would have a single representative on a provincial advisory council, an advisory council, not a council that made decisions. One person representing the needs of over 100,000 students. Think of the simple mathematics of that. Right now, our school divisions very often deliver programming that is specialized to the diverse needs of that community. That programming can be anything from heritage language programming to full day kindergarten versus half day kindergarten, to a variety of specialized music, physical education programs, and so on. Critical services to the communities that our schools serve. Bill 64 would have removed educational experts from the decision-making of the public school system. Schools would be governed by parent-led school community councils, which have broad powers. Right now, we rely on, I want to emphasize, we rely on the expertise within the public school system on educators who are familiar with public education, have worked within public education, receive formalized training as educators to make good decisions within public education. These individuals aren't just teachers, they're principals, they're superintendents, and they're school trustees who undergo a significant amount of professional development to prepare them for the work that they do. This expertise is critical to the success of our public school system. Bill 64, and here's where you've got to start looking at the pages and the recommendations within that K-12 Education Review, but our contention is that Bill 64 really ignored the socioeconomic factors that have a huge impact on student outcomes. One of the things that Bill 64 called for was an increase in standardized testing, but also a different use of the results of that standardized testing, that they would be used on a school by school basis. So in other words, you could look down a list and identify where your school lay compared to all the other schools in the province based on standardized test results. Now, the very organizations that prepare and sponsor these standardized tests will tell you in their documentation that that's not the purpose of these standardized tests. Standardized tests are not there to assess an individual student. They are there to actually assess the needs of the overall system. The problem is when it comes to things like PISA tests, we don't take the time to turn past page 5 or 6 which lists where Manitoba ranks against all the other provinces in the country and where Canada ranks against all the other countries in the world. If you turn to page 45 or page 55, PISA will tell you that the results are to be considered with socioeconomic factors, which is honestly a fancy word for poverty, and allow organizations, allow systems to make targeted improvements to tackle those issues which are becoming a holdback or creating a struggle for our students to succeed. And we know that with the second highest rates of poverty in the country, that this is a huge struggle for students in Manitoba's public schools. We're also have had concerns within Bill 64 about some of the language that's used around parental opt-out of sensitive topics. Our experience as educators tells us that these sensitive topics can include everything from reconciliation to inclusivity, to healthy sexuality, to substance abuse, and more. These are all topics that we would view as absolutely essential in preparing our students to be contributing citizens of the society or of our larger society going forward. Learning about these topics is absolutely essential if we're going to rely upon our students to be the next generation of decision makers for all of us. We're also concerned that Bill 64 threatened what is a very collaborative and collegial system where we work between teachers and school leaders. School leaders, principals and vice principals within our schools were to have been removed from that teacher bargaining unit. It's important for people to understand the collaborative nature of our public schools. I like to think of a public school as simply an extension of a classroom. In our classrooms, our teachers work cooperatively and constructively with our students for student success, and quite frankly, for teacher success as well. The same thing occurs within our schools where we rely on our principals and vice principals to be educational leaders within the school, working collaboratively, working cooperatively to share their experience and their expertise with teachers in the school to the benefit of all. The term principal actually derives from the term principal teacher. And over the years, I think we've forgotten a little bit that our principals are in fact teachers as well. So we look back on the K-12 Education Review Commission, and unfortunately, it's becoming a bit of a distant memory in our minds. The commission is a number of years old now, but it served a critically important purpose. A K-12 Education Review Commission held public hearings that brought together a huge cross-section of people in the province. It was one of the high points of my career, being able to sit at tables to discuss public education with people who were not public educators. And it's not just wonderful to talk about your profession with others, but as a teacher, it was about teaching others about what we do in our schools. The report was prepared for March of 2020. It wasn't released till March of 2021, but government has now had it for 2 years. That report contains 75 recommendations spread across 10 imperative areas. The only imperative area that we felt was really reflected in Bill 64 was that of governance. 9 other critical imperative areas were not really well reflected within the legislation, but I'll tell you now that they're absolutely critically important. Now, I'm not going to go into details on what's in that review. I'm a teacher. Welcome to my classroom. I'm going to give you homework. And if you haven't already looked at the report and looked at the recommendations, I want to encourage you to do so. It's a well-written report. You can read the whole report. You can read the summary. You can just look at the recommendations. The choice is yours. But I really want to encourage you to read that report. If we're not reading it, if we're not referring to it, it's going to get lost. And our students deserve better than to see a very important assignment for the people of the province of Manitoba to be lost. The Manitoba Teachers Society presented a submission to that report. You can find that submission at educationmattersmb.ca. I encourage you to go and look at that as well. More recently, we submitted a set of 26 recommendations to the provincial government prior to their education funding announcement. We made that submission back in December. We know last week we saw that education funding announcement. We were disappointed because it was really a status quo announcement. We were really looking for an opportunity and had an expectation that we may have seen some of our recommendations, some of the recommendations in that K-12 Education Review report reflected in the funding announcement. Why in the funding announcement? Well, to be quite frank with you, some of these recommendations are going to have a price tag attached to them. Some people may think of this as a cost. We'd prefer that you think about this as an investment into public education, an investment into the future of the children in our province. So let's talk specifically about some of those recommendations that the Manitoba Teachers Society made to the K-12 Education Review. We categorized our recommendations across 6 different categories. Let's start at the beginning, which is poverty. I've already mentioned to you the rates of childhood poverty that we experience in the province. So our big recommendations here were establish a universal meal program across the province of Manitoba. We're the only first world country not to have a federally sponsored meal program across the country. But if this is a government that's very serious about making a difference in the lives of our students, province of Manitoba is a good place to begin. Let's talk about transportation strategy. We've seen in recent years downloading of public transportation costs from the provincial level onto municipal governments, but we have to remember the importance of public transportation in our urban centers in terms of physically getting students from home to school. Our students rely on Winnipeg Transit here in the city, just as they rely on transit services in other communities. We also called for a task force to examine how socioeconomic conditions impact students. I spoke at the beginning about how things are linked together. Poverty is not something that just impacts the public education system. It's not something that's going to just be solved by the public education system. There are a huge number of organizations out there that want to work to addressing the needs that exist within our society. Let's bring these people together. And I do want to acknowledge the government is moving in this direction. They have struck a task force. We just need to work hard to see that the outcomes of that work are felt across our communities and in our schools. In our recommendations, we talked about class size and composition. At one point in this province, in the not too distant past, we had a class size cap at early years, from kindergarten to grade 3. That class size cap was removed, and in our opinion, it was removed after a very short period of time, shortly over a year, far too soon before you could prove that reducing class sizes at early years would have a positive impact on children's education throughout their public schooling. If you're going to talk about class size, you also have to give consideration to class composition because we recognize that the needs of our students can vary from child to child, but every child deserves an equitable opportunity to a good public education. So we have to consider both size and composition when we look at formulating our classrooms. Curriculum and assessment. Now you might scratch your head at this a little bit and say, why are you asking for a curricula older than 7 years to be updated? Because isn't it teachers that play a huge role in updating curriculum? You are absolutely correct. Teachers play a huge role in updating curriculum, but curriculum is the documentation that teachers teach from. It is the content that students learn from. And we know within our society that we go through constant change. I'll refer to just some things in recent years like pronoun usage, like reconciliation, incorporating Indigenous ways of learning and knowing across curricula, incorporating mental health within our health and education and physical education curricula. These are all absolutely essential, and we have learned a tremendous amount about the importance of all of these things in recent years. We need to ensure that they're universally incorporated into our curricula. We need to support classroom-based formative assessment. I know there's a number of educators on the call, so when I use the term formative assessment, you understand exactly what I'm saying. For those of you who may be new to the term, when you see the word assessment, I know what you're thinking of. It's final exams. It's the unit tests. Yes, these are important, but before the final exams, before the unit tests, classroom teachers make good use of what we call formative assessments. These are assessments that don't necessarily count for marks, but they give critical feedback to students. They are a critical component of student learning. And when our focus is on provincial tests, provincial examinations, standardized tests, then we lose all our focus on what, in my opinion, is actually more critical assessment of learning, and that's the formative assessments. We also, and I spoke earlier about this, we want to make sure that those provincial assessments and standardized testings are used for the correct purposes. They are assessments of the system. They are not assessments of the individual student or assessments of whether a school is successful or not successful. What they tell you is what supports, what needs need to be addressed within those school, perhaps division, perhaps regional learning environments. We know we need improved access to clinicians and to student support services. Some of these terms sound a little bit familiar to healthcare. We need to reduce wait times. Every day that we have a student within our school that has an unassessed learning disability is a day where we can't meet the needs of that student the best way possible. The pandemic has absolutely shown us that we need to develop comprehensive mental health curriculum. We need to ensure that those mental health supports are there for all students. We also need to ensure that that mental health support, that mental health is built into the lives of our students. So when they leave our schools, they're capable of looking after their mental health in the same way that our physical education teachers work with their curriculum to try to ensure lifelong physical health within our graduates. The pandemic has shown us that mental health is absolutely as important as what physical health is to all of our lives. And lastly, we've got to make sure those clinical supports are available across all grade levels, in all schools, and most importantly, in all parts of this province. Children in the city of Winnipeg should not be advantaged to receiving these clinical supports over children who attend schools in rural areas or northern areas of the province. But I have to pause here and just mention one fact, and it's one of those things that I think is very important for you to understand because it's going to help you interpret some of the messaging that comes out of government. You've heard as part of the funding announcement that we have among the highest per capita investments of government into public education. They spend about the second highest amount per student in the country. I'm not going to question that statistic. What I will tell you, and I would say if you want more information, you really need to be listening to what the Manitoba School Boards Association says about this. But what's funded within public education differs from province to province. And one of the things that we fund within this province are those clinicians and clinical support to our public school system. It's not the same way in every province, so be cautious when you're comparing numbers from province to province. Clinical support is one of the ways that we're different within this province. That doesn't mean that we don't need more of that support. We absolutely do. The fifth area, the development of teaching and leadership standards. Now, the Manitoba Teachers Society is both a union that represents public school teachers within the province, but we're also the professional body for those public school teachers in the province. And in the latter part of 2021, there was a conversation going on about a college of teachers. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It's hard these days to hear anything said about public education and not have people pay attention to it. I don't want you to think that our recommendation was about establishing a college of teachers within the province. It absolutely is not. What we're calling for is a set of uniform teaching and leadership standards that we would work with government to establish within our profession, so that parents have the understanding, the knowledge that the teacher in their classroom is a professional, is absolutely capable and qualified of doing the work that they're called upon doing. So please, this is not a college of teachers, but this is an opportunity to strengthen our profession, making it stronger for the students in our classroom. Of course, any change is going to develop some professional learning. We call it professional development for teachers. We are obviously calling upon adequate funding for professional learning and development for teachers. We also want to bring all of our educational partners together to work in determining those needs. Funding without specific needs is not necessarily going to address the most critical needs. All of this, though, comes the underlying principle of teacher autonomy. We want to recognize the teacher as the professional that they are and the decision maker that they are. Provide the right tools, provide the right opportunities, and teachers will, of course, make the right decisions. We can't possibly talk about, I think, anything in our society without talking about reconciliation and talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. Very specifically, TRC recommendations 62 and 63 dealt with public education and dealt with there being an annual commitment. This isn't a one-time commitment that we can do with every student in grade 3 and then check a box. This is an annual ongoing commitment across the system to both Indigenous education and to reconciliation. We need to work to make our schools more welcoming and more responsive to the needs of our Indigenous communities and our Indigenous students. But we also have to ensure that reconciliation is something that is taught across all of our curricula, across all of our grade levels, and across all of our schools. This is not only about funding, it's not only about professional development, so white colonialists like me can get a deeper understanding of what reconciliation is and incorporate it into our lessons, but it is also essential that we're working with elders, that we're working with Indigenous communities, that we're working with curricula support so that we're all listening to one another and working together with one another. I always pause at this point because I've had opportunities because of the positions I've held that not all of our members have had. One of the opportunities that I've had is to visit nearly 130 of the over 700 public schools in this province. One of the things that rests firmly in my mind whenever I talk about Indigenous education, whenever I talk about the opportunities presented to bring elders into our schools, was a school in St. Norbert that I visited, a school that served a largely newcomer population in the province of Manitoba. And it was watching a group of students within a classroom who were by and large newcomers to this country, listening to an Indigenous elder talk about the history of Canada. And it was a history of Canada that you don't always find written in a textbook, but it's a captivating history. And I will tell you that that elder captivated the attention of those young students in that school. This is about the success that we can achieve with the right supports, the right cooperation, and the right people in the right positions. Lastly, we talk about French language education. I think you're all aware of an announcement last week, and it was a positive announcement, an investment into programming at University St. Boniface to increase the number of French language graduates with education degrees. An excellent program, excellent investment, but it takes 5 years to educate a teacher. So it's an investment that we're going to have to wait to see the results of. I can tell you that there are many communities within this province, there are many students within this province whose need for a French language teacher is today. We need strategies to invest in the retention and the recruitment of French language educators across this province. I've had the opportunity, and we know that there's been much conversation about remote teaching and remote learning in the past couple of years because of the pandemic. I hope I don't shock anybody in the room, but before the pandemic, our members were remote teaching students in many parts of the province in order to bring immersion education into classrooms where we didn't have French language educators on site. We have school divisions across the north where a teacher in one school division will teach students remotely in 2 or 3 other school divisions. And at best, the support that those students working remotely have is an aide who is capable in the French language. Again, our students deserve better than that. I want to give the government credit. They have hired and they are now working on developing some strategies, but I have to reinforce on you, this is not a brand new problem. This is a problem that's been around for a few years, and it is one that absolutely has to be addressed. There are some other issues with French language education that I think are important for all of you. We certainly made them part of our recommendations. We need those adequate supports. And one of those adequate supports is to ensure that we have curriculum that's developed in the French language. You might, and the easy solution here is to think, well, just develop curriculum in English, find somebody to translate it into French, you've got French language curriculum. That's not what French language education is in this country. French language education is constitutionally protected in Canada. Part of that constitutional protection is to ensure that French language education also contains various cultural aspects. So you're not just teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic, you're teaching those things being culturally sensitive to the French, French history within this country. So there's a need to develop French language curriculum in the French language. We certainly would also like to see, as we once had in this province, a dedicated assistant deputy minister within Manitoba Education who is dedicated to the Bureau Education Français. So to conclude with, I've already told you through the talk, I consider you to be a classroom of students. I'd really like you to do a bit of homework. You'll find our submission complete with a lot of other documentation at educationmattersmb.ca. I encourage you to head to that site, read our submission in entirety. If you go to mbteach.org, you'll also find our submission from December on education funding. If the two look somewhat similar to you, I've already told you why. The needs and the students of the province of Manitoba have not changed over the course of the last 4 or 5 years. So the documents are similar. I'd like you to read that K-12 Education Review Commission report. There are some excellent recommendations within that report. Actually, if you read our recommendations to the commission, you might see some of them reflected in the recommendations from the K-12 Education Review Commission. We know that we had it right. We're happy to see that the commission got a number of things right as well. I think an important thing that you need to do is continue. It's written as engage, but I'm going to say continue that open discussion with others about public education, about these recommendations. We saw that as part of Bill 64. Let's not lose that engagement with one another. Let's keep talking about public education. Demand stakeholder engagement. Who are the stakeholders in public education? Well, the Manitoba School Boards Association, the Manitoba Teachers Society, the Manitoba Association of School Business Officials, the Manitoba Association of School Superintendents, the Manitoba Association of Parent Councils. These are 5 organizations as direct stakeholders in public education. They all employ professionals. They're all governed by knowledgeable people within public education, leaders and former leaders within public education. You will learn a tremendous amount by listening to these people. We want to encourage government to listen to them and to continue to listen to them going forward. It's important. Involve these stakeholders in change. It's hard sometimes to say work positively for change, but I want to encourage you to work positively for change. As an educator, I will tell you unequivocally, walking into a classroom of students with a positive attitude towards them, towards their future, makes all the difference in the world when it comes to success. I'm not a politician, I'm a teacher. So I'll speak to you as a teacher. When we're positive about the future, when we're positive of what we're capable of doing, people work harder, they work better. I've seen this through 26 years in a classroom. I know my teacher colleagues have seen it as well. I want to encourage you to do like. I've already talked about educationmattersmb.ca. We've got lots of great information within our website. Like any good website, you can just search on it. We have a document very specific, for instance, to PISA testing. It's a document we developed to explain PISA standardized testing, both to educators, but also to parents. Seek out that document, find that document. It's a great resource. It's going to help you understand and communicate about standardized testing. But, you know, don't be a stranger to our website and don't be a stranger to us. We'd love to have conversations with you. And I'm looking at my watch, and I think I might actually have finished, Wayne, just a little bit ahead of when I said I would. And I did say I was going to shoot for that. So again, thanks for the opportunity tonight. And I'm only too happy to begin to renew that conversation with any of you here tonight in the Q&A session.
All right. Thanks very much, James. That was a great presentation. There's lots for us to talk about and lots to think about. And of course, you know, public education is so important to all of us now and in the future.